I was midway through changing when, without a sound, my stepson, Noah, walked into my room. What unfolded next was utterly unanticipated, a thrilling encounter that I feel compelled to share. My name is Theodore, and this all transpired just under a month ago. The house was still and silent. Though I'd called it home for years, the echo of my footsteps in the cavernous rooms made it feel unfamiliar, like I no longer belonged. My wife, Elisa, a successful artist, was driven, dedicated, and wholly absorbed by her work. I respected her ambition, but it had gradually created a chasm between us. The long hours, the endless late-night calls, they made me feel unseen, an afterthought in her meticulously structured life. Our evenings together had become painfully routine. She'd perch on the couch, scrolling through emails or scribbling notes in her planner, while I feigned interest in a book or a television show. There were no more lingering glances, no tender touches, no whispered confidences. We shared a space but inhabited entirely different worlds. When Noah returned home after university, he brought a spark of life back into the house. He'd blossomed into a handsome, self-assured young man, his effortless charm a welcome contrast to Elisa's aloofness. He was courteous and considerate, always inquiring if I needed assistance with dinner or if I'd like company while I sipped my evening tea. His presence filled some of the void, although I convinced myself it was purely circumstantial. Loneliness can create a yearning for connection, however fleeting. However, the truth was more complex. There was something about Noah that unnerved me, a magnetism I couldn't quite decipher. Occasionally I'd catch his gaze lingering a beat too long, or he'd brush against me in the kitchen, his touch feather-light but deliberate. I dismissed these instances as harmless, attributing them to an overactive imagination. After all, he was simply being polite. Wasn't he? That afternoon, sunlight streamed through the blinds, casting elongated shadows across the bedroom floor. I stood before the mirror, examining my reflection. My blouse was half unbuttoned, revealing the delicate lace of my bra. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I'd once felt beautiful, desirable, but time, routine, and neglect had eroded that feeling, leaving a hollowness I couldn't seem to shake. I shed the blouse and reached for the silk robe draped over the bed. The cool fabric felt luxurious against my skin, a small indulgence in an otherwise mundane day. As I unclasped my bra, the abrupt creak of the door startled me. My heart pounded as I turned, clutching the robe to my chest. There he stood, Noah, framed in the doorway, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite interpret. His eyes widened slightly, flickering between my face and the robe I held tightly. "Sorry," he stammered, retreating a step, his voice strained. "I didn't mean to. I thought you were downstairs." I swallowed, my pulse racing. It's okay," I managed, though my voice trembled. "I didn't hear you come in." "I just got back," he replied quickly, his gaze fixed on the floor as if searching for a safe place to land. I didn't mean to interrupt. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air crackled with unspoken tension. I felt my cheeks flush, the heat spreading down my neck. Despite the awkwardness, there was something in his eyes that held my gaze captive. "You didn't interrupt," I said finally, forcing a nervous laugh. "I was just changing," he stated, his voice tight. I'll leave you to it." He turned to go, but my voice stopped him before I could reconsider. "Wait." He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Yeah?" I hesitated, uncertain of what I was about to say. My mind raced, grasping for an excuse to keep him there, even though I knew I shouldn't. "It's nice to have you around," I blurted, the words tumbling out. The house feels less empty." He turned back slowly, leaning against the doorframe. His expression softened, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I like being here," he said simply. The way he said it, so sincere and direct, made my breath catch. For a moment, I forgot about the robe clutched to my chest, the vulnerability of the moment. His gaze met mine, steady and unflinching, and I felt something stir deep within me, something I hadn't felt in years. "Maybe you should knock next time, though," I said, attempting to inject some levity. He chuckled softly, a low, warm sound as he stepped out of the room, closing the door behind him. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my robe still clutched tight. My heart pounded, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. What had just transpired? And why did it leave me feeling more alive than I had in years? The most unsettling part was the realization that this was only the beginning. In that charged moment, we both sensed something palpable, an exciting tension. I could never have foreseen what was to come. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a haze, my mind far from tranquil. I went through the motions of my daily routine: laundry, tidying the living room, preparing dinner. But my thoughts remained fixated on that encounter. My thoughts kept drifting back to Noah and the charged moment we'd shared. I told myself I was overthinking it, that it was nothing more than a fleeting, awkward encounter. But the memory of his eyes, the way they lingered for a fraction of a second too long, refused to dissipate. By the time I heard the soft creak of footsteps descending the stairs, the house was filled with the aroma of roasted chicken and vegetables. I stood at the kitchen counter, pretending to be absorbed in chopping parsley, but my heart quickened at the sound of his approach. "Smells great," Noah said as he entered the room. His voice was casual, but there was a hesitancy in his step, as if he wasn't sure how to navigate the space between us now. "Thanks," I replied, glancing up briefly before returning my attention to the cutting board. "I hope you're hungry." "Always," he said with a small laugh, retrieving plates from the cabinet. For a moment, the clinking of dishes filled the silence, grounding us in the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the air still held the weight of what had transpired earlier. We both sensed that something had shifted. Something had begun. As we sat down to eat, the conversation was light. His plans for finding a job now that he'd graduated, the old friends he'd reconnected with since moving back. I nodded along, asking questions here and there, but my focus kept wandering, drawn to the way his hands moved, the cadence of his voice, the occasional flicker of his eyes toward mine. "You seem distracted," he said suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. I blinked, startled. "What? Oh no, I'm just tired, that's all." He tilted his head slightly, studying me with an intensity that made my chest tighten. "You've seemed off lately," he said carefully. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The truth was complex, too entangled in feelings I didn't fully understand myself. "It's nothing," I said finally, forcing a smile. "Just the usual stuff. Elise is always busy and the house feels, well, you know how it is." Noah nodded slowly, his gaze falling to his plate. "Yeah, I get that," he said quietly. "It's weird having her so absent all the time. It's like she's here, but she's not really here." His words resonated, and I felt an unexpected pang of sadness. "Exactly," I murmured. "It's been that way for a long time." For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of shared understanding settling between us. When he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes, empathy, perhaps, or something deeper, that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. "Hey," he said softly, his voice warm. "You don't have to deal with it all alone, you know. I'm here." The sincerity in his tone caught me off guard, and I felt my defenses crumble. "Thanks, Noah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "That means a lot." He smiled, and for a moment the tension eased. We finished dinner in companionable silence, the unspoken connection between us lingering, unacknowledged. After we cleaned up, he retreated to the living room, and I busied myself with tidying the kitchen, trying to dispel the feelings that had taken root. Later that evening, as I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I paused by the door to his room, the faint glow of his desk lamp spilling into the hallway. The urge to knock, to bridge the distance between us, was almost overwhelming. But I forced myself to move on. I slipped into my room, closing the door softly behind me, and sank onto the bed with a deep sigh. I told myself it was just loneliness, the natural yearning for connection that anyone in my situation would feel. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The way he looked at me, the way my pulse quickened in his presence, it wasn't something I could ignore. I didn't sleep well that night. My dreams were filled with fragmented images and feelings that left me restless. When I finally awoke, the sunlight streaming through the blinds felt intrusive, as if it were exposing something I wasn't ready to face. I dragged myself out of bed, determined to shake off the lingering haze, and headed to the bathroom for a shower. The hot water did little to clear my mind, and as I stood there, letting the steam envelop me, I found myself replaying the events of the previous day, the way he'd lingered in the doorway, the quiet intensity in his gaze. It all felt like a slow-burning fire I couldn't extinguish. Wrapped in a towel, I stepped out of the bathroom and into my bedroom, only to freeze as the door creaked open. My heart leaped into my throat as Noah stepped inside, his eyes widening in surprise. "Oh God, I'm sorry," he said quickly, turning to leave. "I didn't know—" "Noah, wait!" I blurted out before I could stop myself. He hesitated, his hand still on the doorknob, and turned back to face me. "Yeah?" The words caught in my throat as I stood there, clutching the towel tightly around me. My mind raced, searching for something to say, but all I could focus on was the tension crackling between us like electricity. I began, but my voice faltered. His gaze met mine, steady and unflinching, and I felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. "It's okay," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to go." He lingered in the doorway, his hand still resting on the knob. The air between us felt impossibly heavy, charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing to break. His eyes flicked down for a split second, then back up to meet mine. I swallowed hard. My grip tightened on the towel, but I didn't move. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice soft yet laced with an undercurrent that quickened my pulse. I nodded, the motion more instinctual than deliberate. "It's fine," I murmured, forcing a small smile. "You just startled me, that's all." He took a tentative step into the room, letting the door click shut behind him. "I really didn't mean to," he said, his gaze holding mine as if searching for reassurance. "I thought you'd be downstairs." "I was just finishing up in the shower," I replied, my voice steadier now. "You don't have to feel so guilty." He let out a small, nervous laugh, scratching the back of his neck. "I think we're both a little on edge." That much was evident. Every breath, every movement, every fleeting glance felt weighted with significance. I was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his presence radiating through the space between us. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I couldn't bring myself to step back or look away. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "I just wanted to check in on you." The sincerity in his tone caught me off guard, and for a moment, the walls I'd carefully constructed around myself felt fragile. "Why?" I asked softly, the question coming out almost as a challenge. He hesitated, his expression shifting as if he were debating whether to speak the truth. "Because I care about you," he said finally, his voice low but firm. "You're always doing everything for everyone else, and I don't think anyone ever asks how you're really doing." The words hit me harder than I'd anticipated. I opened my mouth to respond, but found myself at a loss. The vulnerability in his gaze was disarming, and I realized just how much I'd craved someone's undivided attention, someone who saw me for who I was rather than what I could provide. "I'm fine," I said eventually, though the words felt hollow. "I don't want you worrying about me." "Well, I do," he replied simply, taking another step closer. "You deserve to feel appreciated." The room felt impossibly small now, the space between us shrinking until it was almost non-existent. My grip on the towel tightened, but it did little to steady the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. I wanted to protest, to put some distance between us, but the truth was, I didn't want him to leave. Not now. Not ever. "Noah," I began, but his name barely left my lips before he spoke again. "You don't have to pretend everything's okay all the time," he said, his voice gentle but insistent. "It's okay to let someone take care of you for a change." A lump formed in my throat, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. I hadn't realized just how starved I was for connection until this moment. The weight of years of neglect, of putting on a brave face, suddenly felt unbearable. I blinked rapidly, willing the tears away, but one escaped, sliding down my cheek before I could wipe it away. Noah reached out, his thumb brushing against my skin. The gesture was so tender, so unexpected, that it left me momentarily breathless. His touch lingered, his fingers warm against my cheek, and I found myself leaning into him without even realizing it. "Theodore," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The sound of my name on his lips sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt my resolve weaken. His hand dropped to his side, but the space it left felt like a void, pulling me closer. "I don't know what we're doing," I said, my voice trembling. This isn't right." "Maybe not," he admitted, his gaze unwavering. "But it feels real." The honesty in his words was both terrifying and intoxicating. I searched his face, looking for a sign, a reason to pull away, but all I found was an openness that made it impossible to retreat. Slowly, tentatively, he reached for my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. I didn't stop him. The towel around me felt heavy now, a barrier I wasn't sure I wanted to maintain. I hesitated, my mind racing with all the reasons why this was a line we couldn't cross, but my body refused to listen. Instead, I found myself stepping closer, the gap between us disappearing entirely. "Noah," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond with words. Instead, he leaned in, his breath warm against my skin. I felt his hesitation, the silent question hanging in the air, and for a brief moment, I thought I might step away. But then his lips brushed against mine, tentative and light, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The kiss was soft at first, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it ignited something inside me that I couldn't contain. My free hand found its way to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my palm. He pulled me closer, his hands gentle yet firm, and I felt the towel loosen around me. Reality blurred as the kiss deepened, each movement more deliberate than the last. The warmth of his body pressed against mine, the strength of his arms encircling me. It was overwhelming, and yet exactly what I had been yearning for. Every thought, every doubt, every fear melted away as I surrendered to the moment. Each second pulled me deeper into something I couldn't quite explain, something I didn't want to end. His lips were soft but assertive, and the way he held me close, yet careful, made my pulse race. For a moment, it felt as though the walls around us disappeared, leaving nothing but the electric connection we shared. When we finally broke apart, his eyes searched mine, seeking confirmation that this wasn't just a dream. I saw the same questions swirling in his gaze, mirroring my own racing thoughts. What were we doing? How had we let things escalate to this point? And why, despite every rational thought screaming at me to stop, did it feel so impossible to pull away? I started, but the words caught in my throat. What could I possibly say to make sense of this, to undo the spark that had ignited between us? "You don't have to say anything, Theodore," Noah said softly, his voice steady despite the flush creeping up his cheeks. "We can stop if you want." I hesitated, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill the room. My mind urged me to step back, to create space, to pull away from the precipice before we tumbled over the edge. But my body betrayed me. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stood there, locked in his gaze, my chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. "I don't know what I want," I finally admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Everything feels so complicated." "It doesn't have to be," he said, taking a step closer. His voice was calm, yet his eyes held an urgency, a silent plea that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't have to figure everything out right now." I wanted to believe him, wanted to lose myself in the simplicity of his words, but the weight of what we were doing, the boundaries we were crossing, pressed heavily on my chest. "This isn't fair to you," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "Theodore," he said, his tone firm yet gentle. "I'm not a kid. I know what I'm doing." His words hung in the air, challenging me in a way that left me breathless. He wasn't wrong. He wasn't a child anymore. He was a grown man, confident and self-assured. Yet, the vulnerability in his expression reminded me of the boy I had watched grow up. It was that blend of strength and tenderness that made resisting him so difficult. Without thinking, I reached up, my fingers brushing against his cheek. He leaned into the touch, his eyes fluttering closed for a moment before meeting mine again. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm scared," I admitted, the honesty of the words surprising even me. Scared of what this means, scared of what happens if we don't stop. His hand found mine, his touch warm and steady. "You don't have to be scared," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." His reassurance sent a wave of relief through me, though it didn't entirely quell the storm of emotions raging within. "It's not just about me," I said, my voice trembling. "There are so many people who could get hurt." "I know," he said, his thumb brushing gently against my hand. "But right now, it's just us. Nothing else matters." His words were intoxicating, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe them, to sink into the warmth of his presence, the safety of his touch. Slowly he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I responded instinctively, my body leaning into his as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The towel slipped from my grasp, pooling at my feet, but I didn't care. All that mattered was the way his hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, the way his lips pressed against mine with increasing urgency. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered breath felt like a spark igniting a fire deep within me. I didn't know how long we stood there, lost in each other, before he guided me toward the bed. The world outside faded into a distant memory, the weight of reality replaced by the intensity of the moment. As we sank onto the mattress, his hands traced the curve of my back, his touch setting my skin ablaze. "This feels—" I started, my voice faltering as his lips trailed along my collarbone. "This feels so right," he finished, his voice husky and low. "It feels right." I didn't have the strength to argue, nor did I want to. All I wanted was to stay in this moment, to lose myself in the passion that had been buried for far too long. His hands explored my body with a mix of confidence and care, each touch sending waves of pleasure coursing through me. As I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him closer, I realized how starved I had been for intimacy, for connection. This wasn't just about desire, it was about feeling alive again, about being seen and wanted in a way I hadn't felt in years. And in that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was him. And that was the reason I didn't pull back from anything. His breath was soft against my neck as he kissed his way along my skin, his hands exploring with a tenderness that made my heart ache. I tried to focus on the moment, to lose myself in the way his touch sent shivers down my spine, but the weight of everything still lingered at the edge of my thoughts. The boundaries we were crossing felt both impossibly far away and heartbreakingly close. Every instinct told me to pull back, to put a stop to this before we went too far. But his hands, his lips, his quiet murmurs of reassurance made it impossible. "This doesn't feel real," I whispered, my voice trembling as his lips moved to my shoulder. "It's real," he replied, his voice steady and sure. His certainty should have calmed me, but instead it only deepened the conflict within me. "Noah," I murmured, my hands resting against his chest as I tried to steady my breathing. "Are we going to regret this?" He pulled back just enough to meet my eyes, his expression earnest and unwavering. "Do you regret it now?" he asked softly. I hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on me. "No," I responded. I confessed the truth before I could stop myself. Then, oblivious to everything else, he cupped my cheek, his thumb lightly caressing my skin. "Just be here with me." His words disarmed me, my defenses crumbling beneath his intense gaze. Speechless, I leaned into him, surrendering to the moment, to his embrace. He held me as if I were the only thing that mattered. As his lips met mine again, my last doubts vanished. This kiss was deeper, more urgent, more deliberate. His hands moved to my lower back, pulling me closer. I felt the strength in his arms as he gently guided me onto the bed. The world outside faded, replaced by the intensity of his touch. "You're beautiful," he murmured against my lips. His sincerity made my heart ache. I wanted to protest, to say I hadn't felt beautiful in years, but his gaze silenced me. In his eyes, I saw something long forgotten. Desire, yes, but also admiration, respect, even love. It was overwhelming, and tears pricked my eyes, though I couldn't explain why. "Noah," I whispered, my voice breaking as I tangled my fingers in his hair. "This is perfect," he finished for me, his lips trailing down to my collarbone. "You're perfect." His words tightened my chest, my hands trembling against his shoulders. I yearned to believe him, to surrender to the safety of his embrace, but the reality of our actions lingered. "We shouldn't," I started, but he silenced me with a kiss, his hands cradling my face. "Don't think about what we should or shouldn't do," he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. "Just think about how we feel right now." His words were intoxicating, my resolve weakening with each touch, each kiss, each whispered word. He was pulling me deeper into a place I wasn't sure I could escape, and yet I didn't want to. Not now. Not when he made me feel so alive, so seen, so desired. As we moved together, our bodies entwined, I felt a sense of freedom I hadn't known in years. Every weight, every worry, every expectation vanished, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection between us. His hands explored every curve, every inch of me, and I responded with a surprising hunger. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice husky, pulling me closer. "I've wanted this, wanted you, for so long." His confession sent a jolt through me, my breath catching as I met his gaze. "Noah," I started, but the words were lost in another searing kiss. The rest of the world dissolved as we lost ourselves in each other. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered breath ignited something deep within me. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, utterly consuming. Of course, I can't tell you everything, but I can tell you that we went further and further. Just as the moment reached its peak, a sound shattered the haze, a sharp, unmistakable knock at the door. My heart stopped. I felt Noah tense beside me. "Theodore? Elisa," came her voice from the other side, casual but curious. "Are you in there?" Panic surged through me. I scrambled to sit up, pulling the sheet tight. Noah froze, his eyes wide with alarm. "Oh my God," I whispered, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure Elisa could hear it. I was also terrified she had heard me moments before, the noises I'd made. "Relax," Noah said quickly, his voice low, grabbing his shirt from the floor. "Just stay calm." "Stay calm," I hissed, my voice barely a whisper. She was right outside. "Theodore!" Elisa called again. The doorknob rattled, sending a fresh wave of panic through me. "Just a second," I called out, my voice strained. Noah hastily pulled on his jeans as I frantically tried to compose myself. The room felt stifling, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. As Elisa's footsteps moved away from the door, I let out a shaky breath, but the tension between Noah and me remained. "This is bad," I murmured, my hands trembling as I clutched the sheet. "We'll be fine," Noah said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "We just have to be careful." The door rattled again, louder this time. "Theodore, are you sure everything's okay?" Elisa called from the hallway. My heart raced, my breath shallow. Noah snatched his shirt and slipped it on, his movements quick but careful. His calmness should have reassured me, but it only amplified my panic. "I'll be right out," I called, trying to sound normal. My hands fumbled with the sheet as I glanced at Noah. "You need to go." He nodded, understanding the urgency. Without a word, he moved towards the window, fluid and quiet. The sight of him sneaking out like this, like a guilty secret, sent a pang of regret through me, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Be careful," I whispered as he slid the window open. His gaze met mine for a fleeting moment. "I will," he murmured, his voice steady despite the chaotic situation. "We'll talk later." Then he was gone, disappearing into the night. As the window slid shut, I stood frozen, the room eerily silent except for the pounding of my heart. Taking a deep breath, I steadied my trembling hands and walked to the door. Elisa stood on the other side, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's going on?" he asked, his eyes scanning my face. "You've been in there a while." "I was just lying down," I lied, my voice faltering slightly. "I wasn't feeling great." His expression softened, concern evident as he stepped closer. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" "No, I'm fine," I said quickly, stepping back to create some distance. Just a headache. I think I need some water." He nodded, though his gaze lingered a moment longer than I was comfortable with. "I'll get it for you," he said, turning towards the stairs. As soon as he disappeared down the hallway, I let out a shaky breath, leaning against the doorframe for support. The room felt too quiet, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. My mind raced with 1,000 chaotic thoughts. What had I done? How had I let it go this far? By the time Elisa returned with a glass of water, I had managed to compose myself, though my heart still pounded. I took the glass with a small smile. "Thank you," I murmured, as he studied me with quiet concern. "You've been stressed," he said gently. The irony wasn't lost on me. I forced another smile as I sipped the water. "It's nothing," I said, setting the glass on the nightstand. "I just need some rest." He nodded, leaning down to press a kiss to my forehead. The gesture, familiar and comforting, now felt distant, like a shadow of what it used to be. "I'll let you sleep," he said, his hand lingering on my shoulder before he turned and left. The door clicked shut, and I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. The weight of my actions felt unbearable, the thrill of the moment replaced by gnawing guilt. I thought of Noah, of the way he looked at me, the way his touch had made me feel alive again. But what now? What happened next? The following days were a blur of half-finished conversations and stolen glances. Noah and I avoided being alone together, the tension between us palpable but unspoken. Elisa remained blissfully unaware, focused on work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Late one night, as the house lay silent, I found myself standing outside Noah's door, my hand hovering over the knob. The pull to see him, to talk to him, was overwhelming. But I hesitated, my thoughts tangled in fear and longing. Before I could decide, the door opened. There he stood, his expression a mix of surprise and something softer. "Theodore," he said quietly, his voice low and warm, making my chest ache. I needed to talk," I said, my voice trembling. "About everything," he nodded, stepping aside to let me in. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting shadows. I stood awkwardly, unsure where to begin. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," I admitted, my hands twisting nervously. "And I don't know what to do." "Neither can I," he said, his gaze steady as he moved closer. "But I don't regret it." His words sent a shiver through me, and tears stung my eyes. "Noah, this is so complicated. Elisa, he's your mother." "I know," he said softly, his hand brushing against mine. "And I hate that this hurts you, but I can't pretend I don't feel this way." His honesty broke something inside me, and my resolve faltered. "This can't happen again," I said, the words feeling hollow. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said again, his expression pained, "but that doesn't change how I feel." The silence between us was heavy, filled with everything we couldn't say, and yet, as he stepped closer, his hand brushing my cheek, I felt the pull again, the same magnetic force. "I just want you to be happy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Even if it's not with me." His words were like a knife to my chest. Tears spilled over as I looked at him. "Noah." But before I could say anything more, he kissed me again. The gesture was soft, filled with all the unspoken emotions between us. For a moment, I let myself sink into it, feel the raw connection that had brought us to this point. When we finally pulled apart, I knew things would never be the same. The lines we crossed couldn't be undone, and the path ahead felt impossibly uncertain. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Now, afterward, I sometimes feel regret. Do you think I should? And do you think I should tell Elisa about it? Let me know in the comments. It would really help me out.